Hi, you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is Doc LQJ Speaks with me, Doc LQJ, right? The theme of this video is a topic that is so controversial right now when it comes to people and family, especially people who are that come from families where sex is something that is not encouraged in normal conversation, like fluid conversation with your children. So I have a couple of people who've asked me about what's the appropriate time to have the conversation about sex and intimacy with your children. Um, Coming from both the medical practitioner end and you know psychiatric practitioner side, I feel like this is a topic that should be explored with children when it's developmentally appropriate. So, developmentally appropriate, what I mean by that is that children, they start to explore themselves and, of course, their sexual body parts, genital areas when they're pretty young. They first start to um, notice differences and sensations sometimes as early as 2 years old, um, conscientiously. Excuse me. So, does that mean that this is a good time to have that conversation with them? We should have the good touch and bad touch conversation with them at that point because they're exploring is the elements of touch. Okay. And oftentimes these children are barely talking. So it's really important to go ahead and let them know what's appropriate and not appropriate because they're oftentimes in the care of um, caregivers that are not their parents off, while their parents are off at work. So it's important that you have the conversation about good touch and bad touch at that point. Because if you don't, of course, schools will have it by the time they're 4 years old and in pre-K. However, I encourage parents to be their children's first source of information because if you're not their first source of information, then you leave society to be their first source of information. And oftentimes, that information can be inaccurate and detrimental, damaging, traumatizing to your child and to their growth psychosocially. Okay, so that's that piece. When you're talking about sex, sexual matters, and intimacy, different children mature at different ages. However, puberty starts around age 8 or 9, depending on, you know, um, genetic factors, of course, and individual factors that influences that onset. So you should definitely be having a initial or introductory conversation about sex and its appropriateness and safety and opening up the dynamics of communication between yourself and your child at that age, between somewhere between 8 and 11. And then you should revisit the conversation again, once puberty is done and over with, and your child is now a teenager. You should have a very serious conversation and very in depth conversation about sexual interaction and what that looks like, the actual course of intercourse, and its appropriateness for young people and even its appropriateness for adult people or mature people. This is when your child is already doubting much of the information that's going to come from you because they don't see you as a reliable source of information if you've not been open with them in the communication um, throughout, you know, their development. I think establishing a really good rapport with your children includes a high level of disclosure from the parent and being honest and open to discussing topics that your children are interested in discussing on a regular basis, even before we get to this point. When children are going through the phases of adolescence, they're often difficult to deal with and extremely difficult as they struggle to define their identity, and who they are. While they're struggling with that piece, you're definitely not the first person that they want to be talking to, for fear of peer pressure and judgment. So, um, it's important to have that conversation several times over. It's important that when you have that final conversation, you tell them, you use normal terminology and language that reflects um the seriousness of the conversation, but at the same time opens up the dynamics, and you allow that child to use the language that has been displayed before them, in these middle schools or elementary schools, and you give them some time to kind of weigh in on what they consider sex to be, and intimacy to be, and what that looks like and what it means for them at that point in their stage in their life, because that gives you some insight on whether or not just whether or not your child is sexually active. Of course, you want to ask that question during this conversation, but it gives you insight on what society has already contributed to as far as their understanding. And it kind of gives you an idea of what your child already knows. There are various delivery methods of sex education in the school system already. There are some that I completely disagree with. And then there are others that are very structured systems that safely introduce the thought of open communication between parent and child about the topic of sex, and they are very informative to parents and letting the parents know, hey, this is where we're going with discussion now, and just to let you know, if your child has any questions, or if you hear them discussing this is pretty much where it came from. So you have some that I really agree with, and there are some modes of instruction that I feel like are destructive to the parent being the first source of the primary source of information, and reliable source of information. Please, 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 in all that you do, please be extremely honest with your child. Lying to your child in order to get them, or feel like you're swaying them, to not be involved in sexual activities early, is definitely not the way to go. Because if they go to a source that's more reliable, they're more likely to jump out there and start to explore, because and they'll never tell you, because they won't feel comfortable with coming back and discussing anything with you, simply because you have given them a false source of information already. Okay. So I believe it's important that you're authentic, respectful, inclusive, and of course, sensitive to this topic with them. And, here's the thing. Sometimes when you're having this conversation when your child is a teenager, you discover that your child is currently active sexually. Try not to fly off the handle. Try to get a real understanding of, where they are in their sexual activity. So, how active are they? And, to what extent have they been safe? And what measures have they taken to protect themselves and their partner? Um, it's important to explore this, because if your child has been sexually assaulted at this point, and, they didn't consent, regardless of the legal age of consent, if they did not consent to the act itself, you're more than likely to find that out if you have a non-biased or non-judgmental or reactive, non-reactive, stance. When that information comes out, it's easier for you to find this out and help your child through that trauma. So that's my insight. If you guys want sort of like an example of how to kind of bring that conversation to par, for the younger children, I would say, sit them down and say, hey, we talked about body parts. So, you know that your body parts, some of them are public parts and some of them are private parts. Regardless of whether they're public or private parts, no one should be inappropriately touching those parts. So, inappropriate touch is in the areas that are private at all, and also in the areas that are public that make you feel really uncomfortable. So, because you do have some incest is huge. Sexual abuse and sexual trauma in children tends to be more frequent in family systems. So you may have somebody that the child is extremely comfortable with, um, taking advantage of the child. Even a child as young as 3 years old has a level of uncomfortability in situations that are not right. It's very difficult to explain all the dynamics of that piece, but they do. So whenever they feel uncomfortable, it's important that they are given a voice and given authority to use their voice and say, hey, I'm not okay with this. Um, or come to you as a parent and say, Mom, this happened today, or Dad, this happened today, and it made me feel really uncomfortable, and then explain to you the dynamics of the what happened. What that does is reduces the probability of deeply rooted trauma, but it also helps your child excise and exercise their voice early. A way for you to have this conversation with an older child who is now exploring puberty, going through puberty, of course, talk about the way the body changes. That is your introduction into that topic. Say, hey, your body is changing now. You're becoming a young adult, or you're developing into a young man or a young woman now. And so are your parts. It's important for you to know that, for one, good touch and bad touch still applies. No means no. If you're uncomfortable with something, please feel free to let that person know. And if that person violates you, please know that it's okay for you to come and talk to me. And we'll make sure that we get it handled and we'll get the situation resolved. Also, make sure you explain to them that their bodies and their minds are going to be going through transitions. They're going to have sexual thoughts. They're going to have, moments where they don't feel, quite sure of themselves because they're exploring themselves. And of course, they're trying to figure out, they're at the very first stage of adolescence by the time they're done with puberty. So, they're entering a transition where their body parts are going to be hairy and they're going to start sweating and using deodorant. And along with deodorant use comes like they want to really smell good. They want to use perfumes. Some of the girls want to put on a little bit of lip gloss that's colored or lipstick, makeup products, those things as they're trying to discover themselves. Um, so it's important that you having this conversation and you make them feel really comfortable with it. And that's a way to kind of start that conversation for children that are pre-adolescents or in the beginning stages of puberty or in the middle stages of it. Um, for young adolescents, a great way to start the conversation up again is to talk about um, immunizations. Okay, the HPV immunization. Talk about it, the rate of infection, probability of infection, the importance in protecting themselves if they are sexually active. Make sure that they understand that by giving them this information, you're not condoning or sending them out there to have sex, but you want to make sure that if they make that decision, that they make you an inclusive part of that. And they come to you and they talk to you for more reliable, insight, buy-in, and information before they make that final decision to sort of explore the remnants of sex and intimacy. So that is pretty much all I've got. Make sure that you guys share this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel if the content here is applicable to you or someone you know. And as I always say, please share the video anyway because you never know who needs it and when. Okay? Thank you so much for your support. I love you guys. Take care of one another.